today's mindful moment. Okay, get ready to dive into one of the most powerful and honestly kind of dangerous myths in American history, the lost cause of the Confederacy. We're going deep with Edward H. Bonekemper III's book, The Myth of the Lost Cause. And let me tell you, this book is going to challenge some serious assumptions about the Civil War.
Yeah, the lost cause, it's fascinating how this myth has managed to really distort how people see the Civil War for, over a century.
And it's not just some harmless tale, right? This myth has real consequences. Like, it affects how we teach history in schools, how we talk about race and equality, even today.
Oh, absolutely. It's a prime example of how the stories we tell ourselves about the past can really have a ripple effect on the present.
Okay, so let's break this myth down. One of the biggest lies it pushes is that slavery wasn't that big of a deal in the South's decision to secede.
Yeah, like it was just this minor issue. But Bonekemper's book, it just lays out the evidence so clearly. Slavery wasn't just an issue, it was the issue.
He even points to the demographics. The more slaves a state had, the more likely it was to secede. I mean, come on, that's not a coincidence.
No, it's not. And it wasn't just about the money either, right? The South was totally invested in this idea of white supremacy. They saw Black people as inherently inferior and were terrified of what would happen if there was racial equality.
And their own words prove it. Bonekemper quotes some of these secession commissioners, these guys who were sent to try and convince other states to join the Confederacy. And their speeches and writings are just full of this deep fear about racial equality. Like, they literally talk about internal degradation for white Southerners if slavery is abolished.
It's chilling, really, to read those words, especially knowing, the horrors that were to come during the war and in the Jim Crow era. I mean, they were willing to tear the country apart to protect a system built on the enslavement of millions.
Okay, so we've established that slavery was the core issue for the Confederacy, right? But the lost cause myth also tries to paint this picture of the, invincible Southern soldier. They only lost because the North had way more people and resources.
Right. The idea that Confederate soldiers were just naturally better fighters, more courageous, more skilled. But when you look at the actual facts, that doesn't really hold up.
Bonekemper kind of debunks this by, actually looking at what Confederate leaders were saying at the time. And guess what? They knew they couldn't win a straight-up fight. Their whole plan was based on wearing the North down, hoping they'd just give up and let them go.
Exactly. And they acknowledged that they were outmatched in terms of resources and manpower. They were banking on Northern war fatigue, not military superiority.
And of course, the North had some huge advantages: industrial might, a much larger population, and the moral high ground, fighting to end slavery.
Those factors all played a significant role in the Union's victory. It wasn't just about brute force. It was about having a cause worth fighting for and the resources to sustain that fight.
Okay, now let's talk about Robert E. Lee for a second. He's like the ultimate symbol of the lost cause, right? The brilliant strategist who could have won the war if only he had more men and resources.
Yeah, the lost cause myth turns Lee into this almost mythical figure, this genius, practically a saint. But when you actually start digging a little deeper, you find a much more complicated picture.
And Bonekemper doesn't shy away from criticizing Lee's generalship. He points out some pretty big flaws and questionable decisions that led to really heavy Confederate losses.
One of the most striking examples is Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania, culminating in the Battle of Gettysburg. Gettysburg, it's often portrayed as this epic clash of titans, but really it was a major strategic blunder for the Confederacy.
It cost them a lot. Casualties, lost opportunities. It was a huge gamble that didn't pay off.
And even within the battle itself, some of Lee's tactical choices, they're just hard to square with this image of him as a brilliant strategist.
Like Pickett's charge, sending thousands of men across an open field into just a wall of Union fire.
Exactly. That was just a desperate gamble, one that resulted in devastating losses for the Confederacy. It really raises some serious questions about Lee's judgment, about his willingness to risk the lives of his men.
So if Lee wasn't this, perfect genius who was the mastermind behind the Union victory,
Well, that's where Ulysses S. Grant comes in. Now, the Lost Cause loves to paint Grant as this bloodthirsty butcher, this ruthless general who just threw men at the enemy until they were overwhelmed.
Grant the Butcher, pretty harsh contrast to the almost saintly image of Lee, right?
It is, and it totally ignores Grant's strategic brilliance and his ability to adapt and change his plans when needed.
Bonekemper really gets into Grant's campaigns, and you see a totally different picture emerge. He was innovative, he was decisive, incredibly effective.
Like the Vicksburg campaign, for example. Grant completely outmaneuvered his opponents, cut off their supply lines, forced their surrender. It was a brilliant display of strategic thinking.
And it wasn't just Vicksburg. Grant consistently showed a level of military skill that the Lost Cause myth can't explain away.
He was also a much more complex person than the Lost Cause would have you believe. He was known for his modesty, his determination, and his unwavering commitment to the Union cause.
Bonekemper even shares this great anecdote about Grant's decisiveness. Apparently, a quartermaster questioned one of Grant's spending approvals, and Grant responded, "No, I am not sure I am right, but in war anything is better than indecision. We must decide. If I am wrong, we shall soon find it out and can do the other thing. But not to decide wastes both time and money and may ruin everything."
Wow, that really sums up Grant's approach to leadership. He understood that action, even if it meant making mistakes, was always better than doing nothing.
And it's that kind of decisive leadership that ultimately led the Union to victory.
Now, speaking of the Union victory, the Lost Cause myth tries to twist the story of how that victory happened. They love to claim that the North only won because it was willing to wage total war, basically, that they were the ones being brutal and ruthless.
Right, it's trying to shift the blame, make the North look like the bad guys, even though they were fighting to end slavery.
Exactly, and that narrative just doesn't hold up. Bonekemper makes a clear distinction between hard war, which is about targeting enemy resources to, stop them from fighting, and total war, which is about killing civilians indiscriminately.
And while there were definitely times when both sides were brutal, the North's actions, even things like Sherman's march to the sea, were mostly focused on destroying the Confederate war machine, not on massacring civilians.
Sherman's march was undeniably destructive, but it was targeted towards crippling the South's ability to wage war, not on killing innocent people.
Okay, so we've kind of busted some major myths about the Confederacy, the South's reasons for fighting, and how the North won. But there's one more thing I want to explore with you: the role of black soldiers in the war.
Yeah, that's a crucial part of the story that the Lost Cause often tries to, erase or distort.
Right, you see these Confederate flags, sometimes with the slogan "Black Confederates" on them, as if to say, see, black people fought for the South too.
But Bonekemper throws a wrench in that narrative. He talks about how much the Confederacy struggled internally with the very idea of giving weapons to slaves and offering them freedom in exchange for military service.
I mean, it seems crazy that the Confederacy, a nation built on white supremacy, would even consider such a thing.
And that's exactly the point. It exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of the Confederacy. They were totally willing to exploit enslaved people in every way imaginable, but the thought of them fighting as soldiers, as equals, was just too much for many of them.
Bonekemper tells the story of Confederate General Patrick Cleburne, who actually suggested arming slaves and giving them freedom if they fought back in 1864. He was a well-respected officer, but this proposal, it just caused a huge uproar in the Confederacy.
A lot of Confederate leaders were just horrified. They saw it as a betrayal of their core beliefs, a sign of weakness, like they were violating the racial hierarchy they were so desperate to protect.
So what happened to Cleburne? Did he get in trouble for suggesting this?
He did. They denied him promotions, basically ostracized him for daring to question the way things were. It's a really sad example of how the Confederacy's rigid ideology blinded them to solutions that might have actually helped them win the war.
And it wasn't until the very end of the war, when they were clearly losing, that Confederate leaders seriously considered enlisting black soldiers. And even then, a lot of people opposed it.
This whole debate about black soldiers just shows the deep contradiction within the Confederacy. How could they fight a war to preserve slavery while at the same time thinking about freeing slaves to fight for that very cause? It makes no sense.
So much for the myth of all these black Confederates willingly fighting for the South. The Confederacy's own actions tell a completely different story.
They were fine with using black people as laborers, as tools of war, but they refused to see them as human beings, to grant them the freedom they longed for.
Okay, we've tackled some pretty big chunks of the Lost Cause myth. We've seen how it twists the truth about slavery, the Confederate war effort, and even the role of black soldiers. But now I want to talk about something else: Confederate diplomacy.
Right. The Confederacy's attempts to get recognition and support from European powers like Great Britain and France.
They were really banking on that, weren't they?
Yeah.
They thought that Europe's reliance on Southern cotton would force them to join the war on their side.
It was a huge gamble that completely backfired. They really misjudged the situation.
So why didn't it work? What went wrong with their diplomacy?
Well, for one, they underestimated how strongly Europeans opposed slavery. Sure, British and French textile mills needed Southern cotton, but there was also a huge and vocal abolitionist movement in both those countries.
So it wasn't just about the economics, it was about public opinion, about morality.
Exactly. European leaders were very hesitant to openly support a nation fighting to keep slavery. It would have been a PR disaster.
And then, of course, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which really shifted the moral balance of the war towards the Union.
Oh, absolutely. The Emancipation Proclamation turned the war into a fight for freedom, making it even harder for European powers to justify siding with the Confederacy.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? The Confederacy was so obsessed with protecting slavery that they ended up pushing away the very nations they hoped would come to their rescue.
It's a classic example of how a nation's domestic policies can have huge consequences for its foreign relations. The Confederacy's commitment to slavery was a major diplomatic problem.
And speaking of diplomatic problems, let's not forget how the Confederacy treated black Union soldiers.
Oh, yeah, that was another big mistake.
Tell me more about that. What was their policy?
Basically, they refused to treat captured black Union soldiers as prisoners of war. Instead, they were enslaved, forced into labor, and even executed.
That's just awful. Did this policy backfire on them?
Oh, yeah, big time. It enraged the North, made international opinion turn even more against the Confederacy, and even scared potential deserters from the Confederate Army who didn't want to be captured.
So the Confederacy's refusal to see black soldiers as human, their clinging to racism, it actually hurt their own war effort.
It's a tragic example of how prejudice and bigotry can backfire. They were so blinded by their own racism that they couldn't see the strategic and moral implications of what they were doing. It's amazing, really, how the Lost Cause tries to twist history to fit its own narrative.
Yeah, totally. We just talked about how they spun the whole slavery thing as a fight for states' rights and their loss as some kind of valiant struggle against impossible odds. But it doesn't stop there. Nope. Not even close. They even try to claim that the North only won because it was so brutal, waging total war. They basically try to make the South look like the victim of Northern aggression.
It's wild, right? Like they're trying to rewrite the whole script, turning the aggressors into the victims and the liberators into the oppressors.
Exactly. And they do this with people too, twisting how we see them. They make Robert E. Lee into this military genius and Ulysses S. Grant into this bloodthirsty monster.
It's like they need everything to be black and white, good guys and bad guys. No nuance at all.
Right. But as we've seen, it's much more complicated than that. Huh. Lee was skilled, but he made some pretty big mistakes that really hurt the Confederacy.
And Grant, who they try to paint as this brute force guy, actually had real strategic brilliance and understood the complexities of war.
And let's not forget about the black soldiers. The Lost Cause tries to just erase their contributions, both to the Union and to the internal struggles of the Confederacy. Yeah, like we were just talking about, the Confederacy really struggled with the idea of arming slaves, and ultimately their own racism prevented them from taking advantage of that.
And the bravery of those black Union soldiers fighting for their freedom and for others facing just horrific conditions. Their stories need to be told, not buried under this myth that tries to whitewash history.
Absolutely. We can't let that happen. Their contributions are a crucial part in the Civil War story, and we need to push back against any attempts to minimize or erase them.
For sure. So how do we actually combat the lost cause myth, How do we promote a more accurate and inclusive understanding of the Civil War?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think it starts with being critical of the information we consume. Don't just accept what you've been told, Question things, dig deeper, look for different perspectives.
That's exactly where resources like Bonekemper's book are so valuable. It offers this well-researched and convincing counter-narrative to Lost Cause, making us rethink what we thought we knew about the Civil War.
And we need to support the institutions and projects that are working to preserve and teach accurate history, like museums, historical societies, educational programs. They all play such an important role in shaping public understanding.
Right, and we can't forget about individual action. We can all challenge this myth in our own ways, whether it's having open and honest conversations with friends and family or sharing accurate information on social media.
Or supporting organizations that are fighting for racial justice and historical truth.
Exactly. It's a collective effort. We can dismantle this harmful myth if we work together and ensure that future generations have a more complete and honest understanding of this pivotal moment in our history.
As we were talking about all this, I was thinking about my own family's history. My great-great-grandfather fought for the Union in the Civil War, and I've always been proud of that.
That's amazing. It's incredible how these historical events can connect us to our ancestors, across generations.
But reading about the lost cause myth made me realize that even in my own family, there were probably misconceptions and romanticized ideas about the war. It's easy to just see your ancestors as heroes without really thinking about the complexities of what they did, the context they lived in.
I think that's pretty common. We often get these idealized versions of history passed down to us, and it takes real effort to unpack those stories and face the more difficult truths.
That's true, and I think that's part of what Bonekemper's trying to do with his book. He's not just debunking myths, he's encouraging us to engage with history in a more critical and personal way.
Yeah, and to acknowledge that history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about real people and real lives with real consequences.
Exactly. So this whole deep dive hasn't just been some intellectual thing for me. It's been a chance to reflect on my own family history, to question the stories I've been told, and to really deepen my understanding of the Civil War and what it means today.
That's so powerful. That's the real power of history, right? It can challenge our assumptions, make us see things from different angles, and connect us to the past in really profound ways.
Now, I know we've touched on this already, but I want to come back to the whole idea of Confederate diplomacy. It's such a fascinating part of the war that I think often gets overlooked.
I agree. It's really important for understanding the Confederacy's strategy and why they ultimately failed to achieve their goals.
They were so sure they could win over those European powers, especially Great Britain and France. They thought that King Cotton would be their ace in the hole.
They really thought that Europe's need for Southern cotton would force them to intervene on the Confederacy side.
It was a huge risk, and like we said, it didn't work out.
Yeah, not at all. There were a few key reasons why it failed so badly.
You mentioned the moral opposition to slavery in Europe, but what else contributed to their diplomatic failure?
Well, the Union blockade of southern ports played a huge role. That blockade really choked off the Confederacy's ability to export cotton to Europe, which totally undermined their bargaining position.
Right, the Union Navy was essential in cutting off their economic lifeline.
And then there was the issue of wheat. Europe, especially Great Britain, needed a lot of wheat, and the Union was a major supplier.
So the economic picture was more complicated than the Confederacy thought.
Exactly. European powers had to balance their need for cotton with their need for wheat, and in the end, the Union was a more reliable source for both.
And we can't forget about Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Seward. They were really skilled diplomats, building relationships with European leaders and countering the Confederacy's propaganda.
They were brilliant. They used the moral high ground of the Union cause to their advantage and really outmaneuvered the Confederacy on the diplomatic front.
So ultimately, Confederate diplomacy was just a series of bad bets and missed opportunities.
Yeah, they overestimated the importance of King Cotton, underestimated the moral and economic complexities of the situation, and just failed to get the international support they were desperate for.
It just goes to show that diplomacy is crucial, even in war.
Absolutely. And in the Confederacy's case, their diplomatic failures were a big part of why they lost the war.
Okay, so we've looked at the myth of the invincible Southern soldier, the flaws in Lee's generalship, the brilliance of Grant's strategies, the hypocrisy of Confederate diplomacy, and the fact that slavery was at the heart of the conflict. But there's one more piece of the lost cause myth I want to explore. This romanticized image of the Old South.
Ah, yes, the myth of the antebellum South as this paradise of elegance, chivalry, and gentility.
Like Tara, that plantation from Gone with the Wind.
Exactly. A world of huge mansions, beautiful women, and charming Southern gentlemen, all living in perfect harmony, completely ignoring the reality of slavery.
But of course, that's a fantasy, a romanticized lie that covers up the brutality of what life was like for millions of enslaved people.
The Lost Cause myth uses this idyllic vision of the Old South to downplay the horrors of slavery and to make the Confederacy look like it was defending some noble and virtuous way of life.
But the historical evidence tells a very different story.
Plantations weren't peaceful retreats. They were places of forced labor, exploitation, and unbelievable cruelty.
And the lives of enslaved people were far from idyllic. They suffered horrific violence, were denied basic human rights, and treated as property.
The Lost Cause myth conveniently ignores all of that, presenting this sanitized version of history that tries to justify the Confederacy and its cause.
We can't let that stand. We have to challenge these romanticized ideas and face the truth about the Old South and the institution of slavery that defined it.
We need to remember that history isn't a fairy tale. It's complex, often messy, full of both good and bad human experiences.
And by acknowledging all of those experiences, even the dark and painful ones, we can get a more complete and accurate understanding of the past.
And ultimately, a more honest reckoning with history is essential if we want to build a more just and equitable future.
Okay, we've really dug into the lost cause myth and all its different parts. We've seen how it twists the truth about the Confederacy, the Civil War, and the antebellum South. But now I want to talk about the legacy of this myth, how it still affects us today.
That's so important. The lost cause isn't just something from the past, it's still very much alive in American society.
It's like this ghost that haunts us, influencing how we see race, history, and even politics.
One of the most obvious ways we see it is in the debates about Confederate monuments and symbols.
Yeah, those statues and flags have become so controversial, with a lot of people arguing that they glorify white supremacy and deny the horrors of slavery.
And while some people defend them as part of Southern heritage, we have to remember that this heritage is inseparable from slavery and the oppression of Black people.
The lost cause myth has been used to keep these symbols up, to frame them as tributes to Southern valor and states' rights, instead of what they really are, celebrations of a racist and oppressive ideology.
And this distortion of history has real consequences. It keeps racial inequalities and divisions alive in our society.
The lost cause myth also affects how we teach and learn about the Civil War in schools.
For a long time, textbooks and classrooms presented a sanitized version of the war, downplaying slavery and romanticizing the Confederacy.
And while things have gotten better, with a push for more accurate and inclusive teaching, the lost cause is still hanging around in some places.
We have to keep fighting for a more honest and nuanced approach to teaching history, one that acknowledges the complexities of the past and the legacy of slavery.
The lost cause also has a huge impact on our political conversations.
We see it in the language used by politicians who appeal to this nostalgia for a bygone era and use coded language to stir up racial resentment and division.
It's used to justify policies that perpetuate inequality and to block efforts to address systemic racism.
The lost cause is a powerful weapon for people who want to keep things the way they are and resist social change.
And it's our job to challenge these harmful stories and to promote a more accurate and inclusive understanding of our history and our present.
By confronting the legacy of the lost cause myth, we can work towards a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Okay, we've covered so much in this deep dive. It's been a lot to take in. But before we finish, I want to leave you with a few key things to think about.
I'm listening.
First, we need to understand how powerful myths are, how they can shape our understanding of the world. The lost cause is a perfect example of how a carefully constructed narrative can distort history and keep harmful ideologies alive.
Absolutely. It reminds us to be critical of the stories we hear, especially when it comes to history.
Second, we have to be willing to face the uncomfortable truths about our past. The Civil War was brutal and bloody, fought over the issue of slavery, and we can't run from that reality.
Trying to hide those uncomfortable truths only makes them worse, allows them to keep haunting us.
And finally, history isn't just about the past. It's about the present and the future. The lost cause is still impacting our society today, shaping how we see race, politics, and even our own national identity.
It's on us to challenge these harmful narratives and work towards a more just and equitable future, one that's based on a more accurate and inclusive understanding of where we came from.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to think about. How can we use what we know about the lost cause myth to create a more informed and just society?
That's a powerful question, and I hope our listeners will wrestle with it as they keep exploring this complex and challenging chapter in American history.
And if you want to learn more, I really recommend checking out Bonekemper's book, The Myth of the Lost Cause. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the real history of the Civil War and its impact.
Yeah, it's a real challenge trying to untangle a myth that's become so deeply rooted in our culture. It takes consistent effort. But I think just recognizing it when it pops up in conversations is a big first step.
Absolutely. It's like you said before, once you see those patterns, those echoes of the lost cause, you can't unsee them. They're everywhere.
Exactly. And once you start seeing them, you can start asking those important questions like, where did this idea come from? What is it trying to do? Who benefits from this particular version of history?
It's like peeling back layers of an onion. What seems like a simple story on the surface gets more and more complicated the deeper you go.
And sometimes what you find at the center isn't pretty. But we have to understand those motivations, those hidden agendas, to really get the full impact of the lost cause myth.
It's pretty disturbing to think about how this myth has been used to justify so much injustice over the years.
Oh, it's been a powerful tool for those who want to maintain white supremacy and resist any kind of racial progress.
It's been used to defend segregation, to fight against civil rights, and to undermine efforts to create a more just and fair society.
And it's still being used today to fuel racial resentment and division.
Look at how people talk about removing Confederate monuments. Those who oppose it often say it's an attack on their heritage, an attempt to erase history. But that's twisting what's really happening.
Right. It's not about erasing history. It's about confronting it honestly and refusing to celebrate symbols of oppression.
It's about recognizing that those monuments weren't put up to honor history, but to intimidate and to send a clear message of white supremacy.
And it's about taking back our public spaces and making them inclusive and welcoming for everyone.
It's important to remember that the lost cause myth wasn't just about rewriting the past, the history of the Civil War. It was also about trying to shape the future.
That's a really important point. It was about creating a story that would justify the continued oppression of Black people and maintain white power.
They knew they couldn't win the war on the battlefield, so they shifted their focus to memory and storytelling.
They wanted to control the narrative of the past so they could control the future.
And in many ways, they succeeded. The lost cause myth has had a huge and lasting impact on American society, shaping how we think about race, history, and justice for generations.
It's a legacy that we are still dealing with today. But the more we understand about this myth, where it came from, why it was created, and how it's still affecting us, the better equipped we'll be to dismantle it.
It's about taking back our history, telling the complete and complex story, and using that knowledge to build a more just and equitable future.
And that takes courage, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge the stories we've always been told.
It's not always easy, but it's absolutely necessary.
I agree. And I think our deep dive today has given us all a lot to think about and to act on.
It definitely has for me. I know I'll be looking at history with a much more critical eye from now on.
That's the spirit. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for a more just and truthful world.
Well said. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I hope it's made you curious and inspired you to keep exploring this fascinating and complex part of American history.
If you want to learn more, I highly recommend Edward H. Bonekemper III's book, The Myth of the Lost Cause. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the real history of the Civil War and the legacy it left behind.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and share this episode with your friends and family. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a captivating historical mystery. Until then, stay curious and keep questioning everything.
There's a link to buy the book in the episode description.